office of President of the United States.
For democracy belongs to us all.
A government for our tomorrows.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
We gather because we have chosen hope over fear.
Because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Meet this moment as the United States of America.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Michael Scherer, national political reporter here at the Washington Post. My guest today is Ralph Reed, the founder of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, former executive director of the Christian Coalition, the man that Time Magazine in 1995 called the right hand of God. Welcome to Washington Post Live, Ralph.
Thanks. I think that spot is taken, but you know,
That's right.
I'll take it as a compliment.
I want to start with the news last week. We had the felony conviction of former President Trump. The underlying facts in that case concern an alleged extramarital affair with an adult film actress. Several months earlier, there was a civil conviction of Trump in which a civil jury found that he had committed sexual assault. You wrote a book called The Christian Case for Trump. So I want to give you the opportunity to explain how evangelical Christians should deal with these troubling facts about the former president.
Yeah, I did write about this pretty extensively, not just in that book, which I wrote in 2020, but in Active Faith, which I wrote in, I guess, 95, as we were going into the Clinton re-elect, and he had his own foibles and issues, which we're all familiar with, which ultimately led to his impeachment. And in Active Faith, Michael, I wrote that if Bill Clinton is a sinner, then he is no worse than you and I. And has the gospel become so politicized that we can no longer extend grace to someone just because we disagree with them politically? That's a direct quote. I opposed impeachment, did so publicly, urged censure, and said that we should stick to the issues in the campaign, which were welfare reform, budget, spending, taxes, and our desire to have a federal ban on partial birth abortion. That was always my position. It was my position in the Clinton years. It was in the Bush years, the Obama years, and it remains my position. Now, look, individual voters are going to assess the character and the integrity of these candidates on their own, as they well should. And those are going to be highly subjective decisions and judgments that they'll arrive at on an individual basis. And for some of those voters, Michael, of faith, as well as some who may not be as committed in their faith, they're going to decide that either Joe Biden is too corrupt, or that, maybe Donald Trump has been too much of a delusion in the past, and they can't support them. But as Faith and Freedom Coalition, my organization, we're a public policy organization. And Donald Trump was the most pro-Israel, the most pro-life, the most pro-family, and the most pro-religious freedom candidate in the history of our movement. And we supported him in 16 and 20, and I'll do so again in 24.
I just want to press you a little bit on that. Russell Moore is an evangelical leader of Christianity Today who is critical of Trump, said after the verdict, character matters. I think that's something you've expressed in the past too. So can those two things, how do you hold those two things together? The question of character, the Christian idea of forgiveness and sin. Do you agree with Russell Moore when he says that?
Yeah, and I've said it myself, but I just said it. I just said it 90 seconds ago. Character does matter. And individual voters will make those assessments. But I think that the idea that either voters of faith or all voters disqualify someone because of moral failings in the past is just out of step with who the American people are. I think it misapprehends and misunderstands the very forgiving and gracious character of the American people. And by the way, I'm not particularizing that to Donald Trump.
Right.
I mean, Bill Clinton's issues were well known. Michael, he was elected by 2 landslides. Grover Cleveland was elected in the 19th century when Protestant churches flamed with Jeremiads denouncing his immoral character because he had fathered a child out of wedlock when he was governor of New York. Guess what? He was elected. So I think voters make a very nuanced and very complicated differentiation between private character and public character. And in the case of Donald Trump, if he kept his promise to appoint conservative judges, which he did, if he kept his promise to be pro-Israel and move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which he did, if he kept his promise to defund Planned Parenthood and be the most pro-life president in U.S. history, voters are very sophisticated beings. They look at it and they go, you know what? I'm not voting for this person to be my daughter's husband or to be my pastor. I'm voting for president. He's eminently qualified. He's eminently capable. He shares my values. He will advance my public policy views. And keep in mind that when people focus this conversation only on President Trump, they ignore the other candidate.
Right.
You know, Joe Biden has a son who's on trial this week for unrelated charges related to lying on a gun purchasing form. But the tens of millions of dollars that his son took from China, from Ukraine, from other foreign countries with business that were before Joe Biden when he was vice president and have been in front of Joe Biden as president.
Right.
Let's be clear about this. This has no precedent in the history of our country. No family has accepted tens of millions of dollars, in some cases from hostile foreign powers, that were then funneled through offshore accounts and into shell corporations. And voters are looking at that and going, well, what about Joe Biden's character? So they weigh these things, and at the risk of stating the obvious, Michael, these things tend to be, what a shock, filtered through the lenses of their partisan political views.
Right.
And that's true of all voters. It's not just true of voters of faith.
So you've mentioned a couple times now the accomplishments of President Trump during his first term for voters you represent. If I look back at past cycles, I kind of knew what the evangelical agenda, the Christian conservative agenda was, because Roe was always at the top of the list, and overturning Roe, that's now happened. For a while, it was protecting marriage as one man and one woman. That seems to have faded. When you look to a second Trump term, what are the agenda items that you want to see, that your supporters, members of your coalition, want to see accomplished by President Trump? What is the agenda right now?
Well, I think we continue to be strongly and unapologetically pro-life. And while I don't think it's likely that we're going to have federal legislation on either side of that issue, I don't think the pro-abortion lobby and I don't think the pro-life movement is likely to achieve significant progress on federal legislation. I do think in areas such as taxpayer funding and promotion of abortion, things like federal funding for Planned Parenthood, obviously, it's not just the pro-life issue. It affects religious freedom and First Amendment issues and other things that are very important to our constituency. But court appointments at every level of the federal judiciary, but especially the appellate courts and the Supreme Court, is very important to us. And finally, Michael, I would say at a time when you could argue that Israel faces its most existential military conflict and challenge since probably the 1967 Six-Day War. I think having a president that is firmly and strongly pro-Israel, turned the screws on Iran, sanctioned Iran, the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And, I think I'm being charitable if I say that Joe Biden has at times vacillated in his initially full-throated support of Israel in this conflict. And that's really important to us. In fact, I believe that today, in today's evangelical pro-family movement, I think Israel rivals the life issue as in their hierarchy of concerns.
Two issues I didn't hear you mention there, and maybe that was intentional. I just want to make sure is in vitro fertilization. The Southern Baptist Convention recently said it was an immoral practice. I know the president has a different position on that. And the other issue is transgender service in the military. I think there's been some interest in revisiting that. Are those issues that should be at the top of the pecking order here?
We don't we don't really have an objection to in vitro fertilization at all, as long as it's conducted in a way that shows respect for ethical and moral considerations. That is to say, we don't think that there should be an unregulated practice of just willy-nilly, randomly fertilizing eggs and then keeping them and using them in a way that would almost be harvesting embryos. But as long as that's not the case, as long as it's couples that are desiring to have a child, we support that, and we don't have any desire for a legal prohibition of that. We do have a priority in the area of the transgender and the gender identity type issues, including young men competing in women's sports and things of that nature. You mentioned the military, and there are many other issues, by the way. The child tax credit, which will go away in 2025 when the Trump tax cuts expire. You may remember, Michael, that the initial $500 per child tax credit was the top legislative priority of Christian Coalition in the 1990s when I headed that organization. George W. Bush doubled it. Donald Trump doubled it again. We strongly support it. We're also very strongly in support of criminal justice reform. We were deeply involved in the passage of the First Step Act under Donald Trump. He signed it into law. It was the most sweeping criminal justice reform probably of the last quarter century. And finally, human trafficking. It's something we've been deeply involved in. We were very supportive of the passage of legislation that was passed under Trump that basically shut down some of the prostitution and human trafficking websites that were on the internet. The Department of Justice had a very forward-leaning and aggressive enforcement in that area, and we'd like to see more of that. I'll mention one other issue that has kind of elevated in recent years, especially at the state level. You've seen enormous progress in places like Florida, Iowa, Arizona, Texas, and my home state of Georgia, and that's education reform and educational choice. Right. We believe very strongly in that. And I'll mention parenthetically, Michael, that it's part of our very aggressive minority bridge building efforts. I mean, these are reforms, especially school choice, that largely benefit minority and African American families. And we are not the religious right of your daddy or your granddaddy. I mean, we are far more diverse in terms of the issues we work on. We're far more diverse in terms of the ethnic and racial diversity of our movement. And I think that's been all to the good. I think it's shown an increasing sophistication and maturation of our movement.
You mentioned an unlikelihood that there would be federal legislation on abortion. President Trump in his first term supported a bill that would have outlawed abortion on the federal level after about 20 weeks. He has indicated he is not going to push for any federal legislation going forward, that after Dobbs, he basically says this is a state issue. Is that an acceptable position for him to hold?
Well, when he made that announcement, I guess in April, I issued a statement applauding him for reiterating his pro-life views. He's indicated that he believes that post-Dobbs, the political reality is that the bulk of this activity is going to take place at the state level. That was true before Dobbs. Michael, it's going to be true after Dobbs. Now, just to be clear, our organization supports any pro-life law that will save any unborn child at any level of government, local, state, or federal. We would not only support the 20-week pain-capable bill, we would support a 15-week pain-capable bill. We would support a 12-week after the first trimester, or a heartbeat bill, or even a total ban. I mean, we're a pro-life organization. We also support a constitutional amendment that would define life as beginning at conception, and we also support the Supreme Court determining what we believe to be the case, which is that unborn children are already protected under the 14th Amendment, under the guarantee that no one can be deprived of life in the United States without due process of law. So we're strongly and unapologetically pro-life. But as I said, you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass one of these bills, and that isn't likely to happen in the foreseeable future. We recognize that. President Trump has recognized that.
You mentioned the constitutional amendment, and we've been talking about the 20-week bill. In the 2016 Republican platform, both of those ideas were there. That the Republican Party as a whole supported both of those positions. It's not clear to me that those positions are now supported by President Trump, but there's going to be a platform process going into the convention. So do those positions need to be in the platform? Is it okay if the Republican Party is backtracking on questions of abortion going into 24?
I don't think that it would be either morally sound or politically advisable for the party to signal retreat on the sanctity of innocent human life in its platform. The platform has been pro-life now for almost 50 years. The first pro-life plank was adopted in Kansas City in 1976. The 2016 language that you referenced, Michael, was adopted in effect. I mean, there have been some minor language changes, but the support for a constitutional protection for unborn life has been in the Republican Party platform since 1984 at the most recent, and since 1980 at the latest. And it's important that a party, let's be clear, that unique among all parties in the history of Western civilization, was founded out of the remnants and out of disaffected supporters of other political parties. It was really founded as a third party in order to right a wrong, in order to ameliorate an evil, in order to eliminate from our national life what was a collective and national sin, and that was slavery and racism. We believe that the taking of innocent human life in their mother's womb is equally a national sin and equally morally wrong. And if the Republican Party wants to continue to enjoy the fervent and the enthusiastic and the robust support of conservative Orthodox people of faith, that needs to continue to be the position of this party. And for that reason, and look, President Trump is my friend, and I've strongly supported him, as you know. And our organization worked closely with him as president, and we look forward to doing so again. But I would encourage the Trump campaign to proceed with great caution in sending any message of vacillation or retreat when it comes to the defense of the innocent unborn.
That's a pretty strong statement. When President Trump chose Mike Pence in 2016, I think it's fair to say members of your coalition were comforted by that. And over that first term, I think he was consistently vocal in supporting your issues with the president and helping to push those issues. What are you looking for now as President Trump figures out who his next vice presidential running mate will be?
Well, let me preface my remarks by saying, the good news is, we've already seen this movie before. This president, this candidate, has already chosen a running mate, and I thought at the time that it was the perfect pick. I still think it was the perfect pick. Mike Pence was a full spectrum conservative. He was a high impact player inside the building, inside the White House. He and the president had an outstanding relationship. We obviously know that that changed later, but at the time when they were governing together, it was one of the best selections for vice president in my career. And that's saying a lot because we've had some good ones. And I expect the president to make the same quality pick again on the same criteria. And that criteria, I think, is really threefold. And I don't want to speak for him, but you asked my views. Number one, someone who shares his views and values. Doesn't mean that they can't have a difference of opinion on occasion. Doesn't mean that they can't view some things differently. I think he would benefit from that counsel, but you can't have somebody in your administration who's not rowing in the same direction. So shares his views and values. And I'll just add parenthetically, as somebody who was part of the Reagan wave and then part of the Gingrich wave in the 90s, and then I worked for George W. Bush as part of his political team. When you see these big movements wave through a party, like the anti-war movement in the Democratic Party in the 1960s and 70s, like the religious right or the Tea Party movement in the Republican Party, Michael, you generally don't go back. I think the MAGA agenda and the leadership of Donald Trump is decisive, and I think it has changed the party. So you want somebody who shares those views and values, number one. Number two, somebody that you're comfortable with working as your partner in governance on a daily basis, because they're going to be working together for 4 years. And number three, somebody who's ready to be president. That, I think, was the criteria in 2016. I think that's the criteria now. The good news is we have an almost embarrassingly long list of people who fulfill that criteria. I don't know if I want to get into names today. I've got a lot of friends who want to be vice president, and I'm for my friends. But let me just say, I'm glad I'm not having to make the decision. Okay.
Is there anyone who has been mentioned as a possible vice presidential candidate who you would have concerns about?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
I mean, I know a lot of these folks personally. I've worked with many of them for decades. In the case of Sarah Huckabee, just as one example, I think I've known Sarah since she was about 10 years old, because I was very close to her dad when he was running for and governing Arkansas. And, not all I've known that long, but I've known and worked with a lot of these people. And I think it's a hard decision because it's, the level of quality and character and accomplishments and political pedigree of a lot of these people is very impressive.
Okay, so we're running out of time. Let me give you a last question. You've announced that Faith and Freedom is going to spend $62 million mobilizing Christian voters this cycle. A lot of that will be literature drops at churches. I assume you've done some of this research, but I'm curious.
And door to door, by the way.
And door to door. What are the messages? What are the issues that you have found this cycle that are most effective at getting your voters who may be on the fence either about voting or about voting for Trump to get out there and do that?
Well, we're going to be knocking on 10 million doors in the battleground states. We're going to make 10 million get out the vote calls, and we'll distribute over 30 million voter guides in over 100,000 churches. And we're going to be doing a lot more than that, but those are kind of the headlines. Mm-hmm. And on those voter guides and on that literature will be the life issue, where Donald Trump is the most pro-life president in American history, and Joe Biden is the most pro-abortion candidate in American history. Joe Biden wants to pass federal legislation that would not only codify Roe, but at the national level would codify abortion at every stage of pregnancy and would pay for it as an entitlement under Medicare, under Medicaid, as an abortion entitlement. So that's going to be very clear. Religious freedom, judges, but also, Michael, the same issues that are a concern to a lot of voters: inflation, the economy, gas prices, energy, and the border. And all, we educate voters on a range of issues, not just on the so-called hot button issues. We think it's going to be a pretty damning list of particulars for Joe Biden. And we think it's going to be an impressive list of both past accomplishments and future promises for President Trump. We're not going to tell people how to vote. That's not our job, but we are going to tell them where the candidates stand. And by the way, not just in the presidential race, but in every key Senate race and somewhere between 40 and 60 House races. We'll be knocking on doors, dropping off those flyers, and focusing on chasing ballots and getting people to vote early, to vote by mail, and not to just wait until Election Day. I think it's going to make a huge difference.
Let me ask one really quick final question. What has Joe Biden done as president that you think has been good?
I will tell you one thing, and it's funny, I don't think I've ever seen it reported anywhere. But, you know, Donald Trump signed an executive order suspending enforcement of the so-called Johnson Amendment. Mm-hmm. The Johnson Amendment is the death penalty for any tax-exempt organization, including a church or house of worship, that engages in any electioneering of any kind or advocates the election or defeat of a candidate. We want to see that repealed. We think it violates the First Amendment free speech rights of the faith community, of churches and other houses of worship, and of people of faith. We've never been able to repeal it legislatively. Trump suspended enforcement. Michael, it may well be the only Trump executive order that Joe Biden didn't reverse. And that was a good thing. And I will also say, I thought going to Israel and pledging his 100% support of Israel was a good thing. Unfortunately, he just hasn't kept that promise.
Well, I think we have to leave it there. I think I went over time, but thank you very much, Ralph, for joining us today on Washington Post Live.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the viewers for joining us as well. To learn more about all the great stuff we're doing at the Washington Post, please subscribe. There are free trials, WashingtonPost.com/live, WashingtonPost.com/live. I'm Michael Scherer. I'll see you next time.